Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched, where this week I watched Nimona from 2023. This is a movie that was not particularly on my radar, but had been nudged my way at some point with almost no information other than like a picture. And you know, if for longtime viewers of this channel will be aware that I like seeing what the entertainment industry in general is serving to kids these days, and I think that one of the great marks of a good movie aimed at kids is it good for adults as well? Because it should be. If you haven't seen them already, please go check out some of my other videos on some of those, because I'm going to talk about some of them here as comparisons as well. And I was looking for something that was a little lighter. It's that time of year. And so not only was I pleasantly surprised by this as something that did not get a lot of fanfare when it came out, but I was quite surprised at just how highly I think of this film, having come out of it about an hour ago. I am very impressed at what this film is and does and how it does it. And I think it's a shame that it isn't more widely lauded. I'm going to get back to that in a second, because I found some interesting information when reflecting upon this and trying to look up more information about the movie. Part of the reason this probably doesn't seem to have had the same sort of fanfare is because it's being distributed by Netflix. And where once we were saying that Netflix was going to be, you know, the folks who were pushing the industry, the Hollywood, away from distributing, you know, all their stuff in the strict ways they have for so many years, it has now become a place where a lot of things get buried under heaps and heaps of productions that are either licensed or directly produced by Netflix. And it's just an enormous library, often of things that are not particularly good. So when something really good does come out, it is both hard to find it, and it is hard to convince people who may not have found it otherwise that, hey, just because it says Netflix on it doesn't mean it's going to be mediocre. What's more interesting is that apparently this was not originally a Netflix production. I mean, often they aren't. But what's more interesting is this was sold to Netflix after it was allegedly about 90% done. And it happened right about the time that the acquisition by Disney of 20th Century Fox happened, when they did a lot of cutting, let's say, including the entire studio that was producing this film. And so despite the fact that it was almost done, they allegedly they just cut it completely, and it was then shopped around and eventually got to Netflix, which is great. That I'm glad it landed somewhere. But like I said, Netflix has its foibles, but so would Disney. We're going to put a pin in that Disney point for a minute, because I'm going to come back to talking about it when I talk about some of the movies I want to compare it to. This is another in a series of sort of coming of age stories that I think have been becoming more popular recently, and I think in a good way. Socially aware films that are targeted towards kids and giving a little bit more self-reflection and a little bit, you know, that wasn't always true of movies in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, which were often just sheer entertainment. But I am impressed with this movie for a whole bunch of reasons. Now, often with movies aimed at kids, I talk about like what's the target audience and what seems to be the audience that they they really want to make this for. And when I have criticisms of that, if it often comes in the form of, I don't think this is great for this age group and I don't think it's great for that age group, it kind of doesn't hit for anybody. And there is a little bit of that going on with this film. There are certain elements of it of just, I don't know what the standards are these days for what things kids or what things parents do and don't want their kids of certain ages to see. I haven't been a kid for a while, and I know what I would probably say isn't or is great for I think is great for kids, but this does sort of like, it draws a pretty fine line where it's got quite a lot of violence, but it is very cartoony and very indirect when it shows some more extreme things. And so I think it actually does an admirable job of catering towards a younger audience, even if it does have like overall a heavy dose of cartoon violence. What order do I want to talk about things in here? This is difficult because there's a bunch of things I want to compliment. Fundamentally, this is a very basic story. It's not particularly complicated either in the direct narrative or in the subtext. And I think that it is a movie that is very digestible for a wide range of audiences. I honestly think you could show this to kids that are, maybe between 6 and 8 years old, and there are some certain elements of it that I think would be a little too scary for them, maybe a little too violent, but would be totally digestible for that age range. That said, I think as you would go up in ages, there are probably more things for to be kind of clued in on. There's a lot of topics that are touched on of various levels of sort of relatability to kids of certain ages. And I think there's a good chunk of stuff that in here is specifically targeted at sort of preteens and teens in terms of some of its, especially some of its themes around, I guess its core theme is really about belonging and not belonging, which is, not that uncommon in a lot of movies of this ilk. That said, I think there's a lot of very subtle and interpretable subtext that goes a lot longer beyond that, depending on it's whether it's going to be a learning experience just or versus a relatable one is sort of where that line gets drawn, because I think even certainly for adults this can be a very relatable, even if not even potentially sort of nostalgic. That's not quite the right word, but for a sense of the struggles of being a kid of a certain age. And so I think the movie does a very good job of sort of catering to these different audiences without talking up or down too much to any particular one. It does a very good job of sort of running the gamut. As I mentioned, this is fairly, I don't want to use any particular terms for this. I'm going to say socially aware. And so this is a movie that I think is much more sort of modern in its interpretation of I don't know. I can't dance around this. So the movie includes a diverse cast of characters with different skin tones and backgrounds and different attractions and things like that. And it never makes a big deal out of it. It's not subtle, but it's never trying to say anything by it. Which is funny because so much of this movie is very much in its subtext about that sense of belonging and acceptance within a society that can be very strict. And so to see a lot of the things that in our real world, even now, are often very polarizing for whatever reason, be portrayed as totally normal, and some of the elements that are more fantastical, more unreal, be the things that are clued in on as the sort of subtextual equivalent of those real world things that can draw people apart, is really, really well done, because that could have been done much more unsubtly. So, but both as a positive portrayal of diversity and acceptance, as well as a sort of reinterpretation of classic tropes, especially in the fantasy genre, I think is really fun, really interesting, and very unique. To that same point, I love some of the aesthetic choices that were made for this film. I believe this is based on a webcomic, or I think it may have become a published comic at some point later. And I don't know if that fully reflects on the original or not. But the aesthetic that's used of this sort of retro-futurist blending of like medieval knights in armor with future stuff is super cool. I'm not going to talk too much about that because I actually don't want to spoil it. And on the same point, I'm going to try and get the this is just a sidebar. I'm going to try and get a poster that isn't terrible, or is the least terrible, up on the screen for this video. But all of the posters for this movie are terrible and include fairly unsubtle spoilers that I don't really like. Not that there's a lot to spoil, but I just don't like setting up expectations. And also, all of the designs for the posters that I've seen, including the one that will be up in front of you right now, I think are terrible. But that's a separate thing. So that's kind of interesting, because with this really good aesthetic and this really terrible poster, I think the animations in this film are fantastic, incredible. I'm really, really impressed and fascinated by the style that they used here. So many of the individual shots, the individual frames are beautifully designed. And as far as I can tell, this is a completely CG 3D world that and animation style, but it's very stylized in a couple of different ways. For one, it is very flat coloring on a lot of things, which I think is a huge plus. I think if you stare at it too long, especially for certain things, for certain individual scenes or certain frames, you can look at it and go, this is very simplistic, it's very flat, it's kind of dull. But not seeing the movie in motion makes a big difference. I think that it uses to very good effect a simplistic style with very deliberate, sort of almost over-designed elements. These huge armors, huge pauldrons, these sharp lines, very curvy lines, these exaggerated elements are used to great effect to sort of do storytelling on their own, but they also lend themselves to letting you do a lot of action within frame without it feeling overly busy. This is something I've talked about before in other contexts. I think all too often it can be animation in particular, but a lot of things can feel compelled to fill the frame with layer upon layer of stuff. And so, especially in high action scenes with a lot of camera movement and things like that, I think that is where, in particular, the simplistic designs can really shine as being very legible on screen at all times, even in extreme chaos. And so it lends itself to a different kind of design. And that's not to say that this can't be incredibly beautiful as well. There are certain scenes and certain interior shots and things like that that I think especially have some really nice design to them, both in designing the elements within rooms and then going over with texturing and lighting to make those places have emotions and a life attached to them. And so there's a lot of really nice static shots as well. There are only a few that sort of don't fit into either of those categories where it did stand out to me of like, oh, this is a fairly simplistic design. And weirdly, that drew my attention to it more. There are little things I could poke at, but I feel it's completely unfair of me to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway, only because it bothers me. I know it is very much a hallmark of especially kids' movies, but movies in general, that when doing visual storytelling and wanting to make things really clear, you over-design certain things or overemphasize certain elements to do storytelling things. And one of the earliest on things that sort of caught my attention, and if you think about it too much within the narrative, started to bother me a lot. And there's a lot of these in the film, but anyway, this is a very long run on Claws. The one of our main characters is dressed in armor that does not match anyone else, and it doesn't make any sense in the narrative why that should be the case. In fact, it is kind of directly contrary to what's being said, and so I understand why, especially for a kids' film, these visual designs are deliberately they're deliberately wrong within the world, if that makes sense. But it is just kind of funny. Anyway, sidebar over on that. I love the animation style that's going on here. This is sort of halfway in between what is at this point a fairly traditional CGI style, something like Turning Red, which pin in that still again, versus something like the animated Spider-Man films, which I still have not watched, sorry, where the animated Spider-Man films are sort of their own thing that's been going on for a little while now. This movie, I think, makes really nice use of sort of switching when it needs to between very sort of normal stylistically things that are in line with sort of Disney-esque, and then overemphasizing, doing these very exaggerated animation techniques, especially for certain characters in certain contexts, to do visual emphasis, visual storytelling, and let the animation flex. It's not trying to do a singular visual style all the way throughout. It's flexible, and I think it uses that flexibility to really good effect. I want to be more detailed, and I'm sorry if it's not clear what I'm saying here, but I think as soon as you see what I'm talking about, especially for one of the main characters and how it's used, it will be very clear what I mean, how wonderfully this uses its animation style to do more than just animate. Let's see. What else can I talk about? I'm kind of all over the place on this one because I like so much of it. The vocal casting is totally fine. I don't want to say unremarkable, and I hesitate to even say fine, because it feels unfavorable. But I want to say that it's completely serviceable. It's good even, but it doesn't stick out in the way that certain vocal performances in some other things in the last few years that I've watched have really wowed me with what the voice actors do. And that's not a fault. It's just one thing that would have knocked it up a little bit further in its sort of rankings. Now, it's been a little while now since I've watched Turning Red. And in the course of this series of videos that I've made, Turning Red probably, I'm pretty sure, still tops the chart in terms of kids' films and animated films, in terms of really wowing me in doing new things and really pushing what I think kids' films can and should be. This is not quite at the same level in terms of the uniqueness and necessity of its narrative. Like I said, it's fairly simple in its story and its themes, but it is definitely getting up there. I don't have the full list of my movies in front of me, but as far as the things I've watched in the last few years, it's very impressive. And again, this is really the reason why I want this to get more attention. I think this is something that is, I was about to say worth sequels, but sequels always get messy. I really like this. I think it's really unique and well done. I want to see this studio be encouraged. I don't know whether the author of the books it's based on has written more content, or whether it would be original content or some such thing. I just am really charmed by this film. It's ultimately just very charming, well done, modern, forward thinking, and a good time. And also will play on your emotions very, very well. Yeah, I was really surprised by just how good this film was. I'm going to go in circles if I try to talk about that again. Anyway, it's quite good. It's easy to watch. It's pretty short too, surprisingly, because it's got quite a bit of content crammed into its very well-paced runtime. But anyway, I think I should end it there before I keep rambling on it. Thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I think this is the last one of the year. This show's been going on for a while now. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. And I'll see you guys next time.